Kieran's calloused hands crushed the brim of his worn hat as the auctioneer's gavel slammed down with finality. Sold to Mr. Aldrich Whitmore for $300. The woman on the auction block, Evangeline Hartwell, kept her chin raised. Despite the iron shackles around her wrists, her emerald eyes scanning the jeering crowd until they found his. For one heart-stopping moment, time froze between them. She'd been the banker's daughter once, untouchable as morning mist. Now, she stood in tattered calico, her honey-colored hair escaping its makeshift bun, being sold like livestock to pay her father's gambling debts. Kieran's stomach churned as Whitmore, the territory's most notorious saloon owner, stepped forward. With a satisfied smirk, everyone knew what happened to women who disappeared into his establishment across the state line. They were never seen again. Now hold on there, Whitmore. Kieran's voice cut through the crowd's murmur as he pushed forward, his boots heavy on the wooden platform. I got $400. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up. $400 was more than most ranch hands saw in 2 years. Everyone in Copper Creek knew Kieran McBride lived on beans and jerky, sending every spare penny to his ailing mother back east. Whitmore's pale eyes narrowed to slits. $500. Kieran's heart hammered against his ribs. He had exactly $412 to his name, his mother's medicine money saved coin by agonizing coin. But as Evangeline's gaze met his again, he saw something that made his decision inevitable. Not gratitude or plea, but recognition. She remembered the shy ranch hand Hood brought her wildflowers when they were children. Hood taught her to ride bareback when her father wasn't watching. Hood loved her silently through all the years she'd been beyond his reach. $600, he called out, his voice steady despite the lie. He'd figure out the rest later, even if it meant working himself to death. Whitmore's face flushed purple. Oh, $700, and that's my final offer. The crowd fell silent. Now $700 could buy a small farm, a new life. Kieran felt sweat trickle down his spine as he realized he'd pushed too far. He had nothing left to offer except, "I'll work for you," he said directly to Whitmore, ignoring the auctioneer entirely. 3 years of labor, no wages, in addition. To the $400 cash, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Evangeline's eyes widened, a flash of something fear, concern, crossing her face. Whitmore studied him like a snake eyeing a mouse. "You'd indenture yourself, McBride? For her?" "For her," Kieran confirmed without hesitation. But Whitmore's smile was cruel. "No deal. I want her, not some lovesick cowboy." He turned to the auctioneer. 700 stands. Desperation clawed at Kieran's throat. In 30 seconds, Evangeline would belong to a man who collected beautiful women like trophies, and she'd vanish forever into his private hell. That's when Doc Morrison stepped from the crowd, his weathered face grim. "Actually, Whitmore, there's something you should know. The girl's got consumption. Saw her coughing blood just this morning." It was alike here and could see it in the doctor's eyes. But Whitmore recoiled, as if stung. Whitmore's face twisted, with disgust as Doc Morrison's words hung in the air. Consumption. He backed away from the auction block as if Evangeline might infect him through proximity alone. "You didn't disclose her condition, Henderson." The auctioneer sputtered nervously. I wasn't aware of any illness then. I withdraw my bid." Whitmore snapped, his desire for Evangeline evaporating like morning dew. He'd seen too many die coughing blood to risk bringing disease into his establishment. "Find yourself another." "Fool!" Kieran's pulse thundered as opportunity crashed into him like a wild Mustang. 400, he repeated firmly, stepping forward before anyone else could reconsider. "Going once, ... The auctioneer's voice wavered, clearly disappointed at losing the higher bidder. "Going twice, ... Wait." Judge Cornelius Blackthorne emerged. From the crowd, his silver beard gleaming in the afternoon sun. He was Copper Creek's most powerful man, owner of the largest cattle operation in 3 counties. "I'll offer 500, but not for the same purpose as Whitmore." Kieran's blood ran cold. Blackthorne was known for his peculiar appetites and his collection of servants who worked his remote mountain ranch. Some said they lived well. Others whispered darker tales. "She worked my household," Blackthorne continued smoothly. "Respectably. I need a woman who can read and write to manage my correspondence. It sounded civilized, but Kieran knew better. Blackthorn's household was 20 miles from civilization. His previous secretaries had all mysteriously disappeared after short tenures. 600, Kieran called out desperately, knowing he didn't have it, but praying Doc Morrison's lie had bought him enough time to think. Blackthorn's gray eyes fixed on him with predatory interest. You seem awfully determined, McBride. At your stake in this. The crowd waited. Kieran felt the weight of every stare, but most heavily Evangeline's. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't read, part confusion, part something. That might have been hope. She's ... Kieran swallowed hard. The truth would sound foolish to men like Blackthorn, but it was all he had. She deserves better than what either of you is offering. A harsh laugh escaped Blackthorn's throat. Sentiment from a cowboy? How refreshing. His tone turned sharp. 700. Kieran's mind raced. He had no more money, no more bargaining, chips, except his own life. But then Evangeline spoke for the first time since being dragged to the platform. I choose him. Her voice rang clear across the crowd, stopping conversations mid-sentence. The auctioneer blinked in confusion. Ma'am, this isn't exactly how, according to territorial law, she continued, her chin tilted defiantly. Debtor may choose there. Creditor, if multiple parties offer equivalent value? I choose Kieran McBride. Blackthorn's face darkened. Equivalent value? The boy doesn't have $700. But he has something you don't, Evangeline said, her emerald eyes never leaving Kieran's face. I trust. Judge Blackthorn studied her for a long moment, then threw back his head and laughed a sound like winter wind through bare branches. Interesting. Very well, Miss Hartwell. If young McBride can match my 700 by sundown, you're his. If not, ... double quotes, his smile turned predatory. You come with me? The crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excitement over the unexpected drama. Kieran remained frozen on the platform as the full weight of his situation crashed down on him. He had exactly 6 hours to find $300 he didn't have, or watch the woman he'd loved since childhood disappear into Blackthorn's web. Doc Morrison approached quietly. That was a damn fool thing you just did, son. I know, Kieran replied, his voice hollow. Good thing I'm a damn fool, too. The old doctor pressed a leather pouch into Kieran's hand. 200? It's everything I've got saved. Kieran stared at the money, overwhelmed. Doc, I can't. You can, and you will. A girl's got fire in her, always has. She doesn't deserve. What Blackthorn's got planned? Doc Morrison's eyes were serious. But you still need another 100, and sundown's coming fast. Kieran clutched the leather pouch as Doc Morrison melted back into the dispersing crowd, leaving him alone with the crushing weight of impossible arithmetic. $600 in hand, 100 still needed. And the sun already beginning its descent toward the western mountains. He found Evangeline sitting on the courthouse steps, her shackles removed, but her wrists still bearing angry red marks. She looked up as his shadow fell across her, and for the first time in years, they were truly alone together. You didn't have to do this, she said quietly. But her voice carried none of the dismissal he'd grown accustomed to during their childhood. Instead, there was something raw and vulnerable in her tone. Yes, I did. Kieran settled beside her on the worn stone steps, careful to maintain a respectful distance. I've been watching you from across this town for 15 years, Evie. Watching, and wanting, and never having the courage to speak my piece. She turned to study his profile, the strong jaw now shadowed with stubble. It's the same gentle brown eyes that had watched her with quiet devotion through countless church services and town gatherings. I noticed, she admitted softly. More than, the confession hit him like a physical blow. Then why? Because I was the banker's daughter, and you were a ranch hand, she said simply. Because my father had plans for me that didn't include love, only business arrangements. Because I was a coward who chose safety over my heart. Kieran's chest tightened, and now I'm nobody's daughter, with nothing left to lose. She met his eyes directly. Now I can choose freely, even if it's from an auction block. Before, he could respond, heavy footsteps approached. Sheriff Dalton Wade emerged from the courthouse, his expression grim. "McBride, we need to talk." Kieran rose slowly, every instinct screaming danger. Wade was Blackthorn's cousin and had never been subtle about whose interests he served. Problem, Sheriff? Might be. Wade's hand rested casually on his gun belt. Had an interesting conversation with Judge Blackthorn. Seems he's concerned. About this auction business, wondering if maybe the debt paperwork wasn't quite in order. Evangeline shot to her feet. "The debt is legitimate," my father signed. "Documents can be questioned," Wade interrupted smoothly, "especially when there's talk of illness, of misrepresentation. Might be the whole auction was invalid." Kieran understood immediately. Blackthorn was changing the rules, using his influence to nullify the auction entirely. If there was no legal sale, Evangeline would simply disappear, taken for questioning, and never seen again. "You can't do this," Kieran said, his voice low and dangerous. Wade smiled coldly. "I can do whatever's necessary to maintain order. Now, Miss Hartwell needs to come with me for further questioning about her father's debts." No, the word came. Out harder than Kieran intended, carrying 15 years of suppressed frustration and desperate love. Wade's eyes narrowed. Sounded like defiance, McBride. And it was. The sheriff's hand moved toward his gun, but stopped as a new voice cut through the tension. "Sheriff Wade, what seems to be the problem here?" Father Miguel Santoro approached from the direction of the small Catholic church, his black robes rustling. In the afternoon breeze, the priest was new to Copper Creek, having arrived only 6 months ago. But he'd already earned respect for his unwavering moral stance and his complete immunity to intimidation. Wade shifted uncomfortably. Even Blackthorn was careful around the church. "Just some questions about the auction, Father." "Ah, yes. I witnessed the proceedings." Father Santoro's dark eyes were calm but alert. Everything appeared quite legal and proper. The young woman made her choice freely, as is her right under territorial law. "There are concerns about undisclosed illness." "I see no illness," the priest said mildly, glancing at Evangeline. "Do you feel unwell, my child?" "No, Father," she replied firmly. "Then, I see no problem." Father Santoro turned back to Wade. "Unless you have specific evidence of wrongdoing, I believe these young people should be allowed to conduct their business in peace." Wade's jaw worked silently. He couldn't openly defy a priest without serious consequences, but Kieran could see the calculation in his eyes. This wasn't over. "Fine," Wade said finally, "but you've got till sundown, McBride. Miss Hartwell stays in town until this is settled one way or another." As the sheriff stalked away, Father Santoro studied Kieran with knowing eyes. "You're short on funds, I suspect." It wasn't a question. Kieran nodded miserably. "Come with me," the priest said simply. "Both of you." Father Santoro led them through the weathered wooden doors of St. Catherine's Chapel. The interior dim and cool despite the afternoon heat. Dust motes danced in colored lights streaming through the single stained glass window, a simple but beautiful piece depicting Christ blessing the children. Kieran had never been inside. Ranch hands rarely had time for Sunday services. "Sit," the priest instructed, settling onto a front pew and gesturing for them to join him. "Now tell me truthfully about your situation." Kieran found himself pouring out the entire story, his years of silent love, his mother's medical expenses, the impossible choice between Evangeline's freedom and his family's survival. Father Santoro listened without judgment occasionally, nodding or asking a clarifying question. "You have $600, the priest summarized when Kieran finished. "You need 700 by sundown, which is ... He glanced at the shaft of light slanting through the window, perhaps 3 hours away. "Yes, Father." "And if you fail, this Judge Blackthorn will claim the young lady." Evangeline spoke up. "Father, you don't understand what kind of man Blackthorn is. The women who go to his ranch I understand perfectly, my child." The priest's voice carried a hardness that surprised them both. "I've encountered his type before in other towns. Men who use their power to collect what cannot be purchased." He rose and moved to the simple wooden altar, running his fingers along its carved edge. "There is something you should know about me. Before I took holy orders, I was. Let's say I understood money very well. I managed investments for wealthy families in San Francisco. Kieran blinked in surprise. This humble frontier priest had been a financier? I have some savings, Father Santoro continued. Not much by worldly standards, but perhaps enough. However, I cannot simply give you money. The church has rules about such things. And it would raise questions I'd prefer not to answer. Then what? Kieran began. A wager, the priest said simply. I will bet you $100 that you cannot perform a specific task before sundown. Evangeline looked confused. Father, gambling is sometimes necessary, he interrupted gently. What I propose is this. I have a horse in the stable behind the church, a mare named Esperanza Hope. She's never been broken to saddle, and I lack the skill to train her myself. If you can ride her successfully before sundown, you win the bet and keep the money. If you cannot, ... double quotes, he shrugged, but you'll have tried. Kieran stared at him. It was obviously a setup. The priest was manufacturing a reason to give him the money while maintaining plausible deniability. But why? Would a man of God risk his reputation for two strangers? Why? He asked quietly. Father Santoro's eyes grew distant, because 15 years ago, in another town, I watched a good man lose the woman he loved to a monster like Blackthorn. I was younger then, more concerned with protocol than people. I did nothing. His gaze sharpened. I've regretted that inaction every day since. And if Blackthorn causes trouble for you, let me worry about Judge Blackthorn. The priest's smile was enigmatic. I suspect he'll find me more difficult to intimidate than he anticipates. They moved to the small stable behind the church, where a magnificent chestnut mare paced restlessly in her stall. Esperanza was clearly a quality animal. Her line spoke. Of Arabian blood, built for speed and endurance, rather than the heavy farm work most frontier horses performed. She was abandoned here 3 months ago, Father Santoro explained as they approached the stall. Probably stolen, then dumped when she proved too difficult to handle. She's been fed and cared for, but no one's been able to get near her with a saddle. Kieran studied the mare's eyes, intelligent, wary, but not vicious. She'd been hurt, probably mistreated, but there was still trust buried beneath the fear. He'd seen the same look in Evangeline's eyes at the auction. I'll need some time with her, he said quietly. Time we don't have, Evangeline pointed out, but her voice carried hope now instead of despair. Then I'd better work fast. Kieran glanced at the sun, measuring its progress toward the horizon. 2.5 hours, maybe 3 if they were lucky. He opened the stall door slowly, speaking in low, gentle tones as he'd learned to do with skittish cattle. Esperanza snorted and backed away, but she didn't strike or attempt to bolt. Ow. Was encouraging. Easy, girl, he murmured, extending his hand palmed up. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore. Esperanza's nostrils flared as she caught Kieran's scent, her dark eyes studying him with the wariness of an animal that had learned not to trust human intentions. For 20 minutes he stood motionless in the stall doorway, speaking softly. About nothing important, the weather, the church's peaceful atmosphere, his own nervousness about the approaching deadline. Gradually, the mare's rigid posture began to relax. Her ears, which had been pinned flat against her skull, slowly rotated forward. When she finally took a tentative step toward him, Kieran felt his heart skip. That's it, he breathed, allowing her to sniff his outstretched hand. Nothing to fear. Evangeline watched from outside the stall, her fingers gripped tight around the wooden rails. How did you learn to do that? Spent most of my life around scared things, Kieran replied, without taking his eyes off Esperanza. Horses, cattle. Myself when I was younger. Fear speaks the same language everywhere. The mare allowed him to touch her muzzle, then her neck. Her coat was silked beneath his calloused palm, trembling slightly, but not pulling away. Trust was building, fragile as spun glass but real. Father Santoro appeared beside Evangeline. It's been an hour, he said quietly. How much time do you need? As long as she needs, Kieran answered, though sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool stable air. He'd broken horses before. but never with a deadline hanging over his head like an executioner's blade. Kieran Evangeline's voice was tight with worry. "Maybe we should." She was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, multiple riders moving fast. Through the stable's open door, they could see Sheriff Wade leading 4 of Blackthorn's men toward the church. Judge himself rode slightly behind, his silver beard gleaming in the late afternoon sun. "Trouble," Father Santoro murmured. Wade dismounted and strode toward them, his deputy flanking him with obvious intimidation in mind. "Time's up, McBride. Miss Hartwell needs to come with us." "The sun hasn't set," Kieran replied evenly, though. His hands never stopped their gentle stroking of Esperanza's neck. The mare sensed the tension and began to shift restlessly. Blackthorn's voice carried from the stable entrance. "I'm afraid there's been a development. We've discovered irregularities in the original debt documentation. The auction is voided." "Father." Santoro stepped forward. "What sort of irregularities?" "The kind that require investigation," Wade said smoothly. "Miss Hartwell will be held pending resolution. Held not questioned, not protected held." Everyone present understood what that meant. Kieran felt something snap inside him, 15 years of watching from the sidelines, of accepting his place as invisible, of letting others make decisions about his life and the people he loved. His voice came out deadly quiet. "No." Wade's hand moved to his gun. "McBride, don't make this harder than I said no." Kieran turned to face them fully, and something in his expression made even Wade hesitate. "You want or you'll have to go through me." "That can be arranged," Blackthorn said coldly from the doorway. But Esperanza, sensing Kieran's emotional shift, suddenly pressed her head against his chest, a gesture of complete trust that stunned everyone watching. The mare who wouldn't let anyone near her was offering comfort to the man who'd shown her gentleness. "Remarkable," Father Santoro said softly, then louder. "Gentlemen, you're interrupting a legal wager. Mr. McBride still has ... He glanced at the sun. 90 minutes. To complete his task. "What task?" Wade demanded. "He's betting he can ride that mare," the priest explained. "If he succeeds, he wins the $100 he needs. If not," he shrugged, "then your employer gets what he wants anyway." Blackthorn's eyes narrowed as he studied the scene. Nervous horse, the determined ranch hand, the woman watching with obvious emotional investment. "And if we simply take her now, then you'll have to explain to the territorial governor why you interfered with a church-sanctioned wager, Father." Santoro replied mildly. "I understand he's quite devout. Catholic, I believe." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. The territorial governor was indeed a practicing Catholic, and his support kept men like Blackthorn in power. Open defiance of the church would have consequences. Blackthorn's smile was razor-thin. "Very well. 90 minutes, McBride. But when you fail, and you will fail, she comes with me immediately." As the men withdrew to wait, Kieran turned back to Esperanza. The mare was trembling again, agitated by the confrontation. He'd lost precious time, and now the pressure was suffocating. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted quietly to Evangeline. She reached through the rails to touch his arm. "Yes, you can, 'cause you're the only man I've ever met who puts someone else's trust before his own fear." Her words hit him like a physical blow. Looking into her emerald eyes, he saw not just faith in his abilities, but something deeper, something that made the impossible suddenly seem merely difficult. With 60 minutes remaining, Kieran made his choice. Instead of rushing to saddle Esperanza, he did something that made Evangeline's breath catch and caused even Father Santoro to raise an eyebrow. He sat down in the middle of the stall, the mare startled, snorting and backing toward the far wall. But Kieran remained perfectly still, cross-legged in the straw, his hands resting open on his knees. "What are you doing?" Evangeline whispered urgently. "Showing her she's got nothing to fear from me," he replied without moving. "Trust can't be forced, only earned." Outside, they could hear Blackthorn's men growing restless. Wade called out, 45 minutes, McBride. Maybe you should quit while you still can." Kieran ignored them. For 20 minutes, he sat motionless, while Esperanza watched him with growing curiosity. Gradually, she began to approach, first stretching her neck toward him, then taking tentative steps closer. When she finally lowered her head to sniff his hair, Kieran slowly raised one hand to stroke her face. "There you are, beautiful girl. I know exactly how you feel. How's that?" Evangeline asked softly. Scared of being hurt again, convinced that trusting someone new is just asking for more pain. His voice was barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of years. "But sometimes you meet someone who makes the risk worth taking." His eyes met Evangeline's through the rails, and she felt her heart stutter. About the horse, 20 minutes left. Kieran rose slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. Esperanza allowed him to run his hands along her flanks, checking for old injuries or tender spots. She was sound, just damaged emotionally. "Bring me the saddle," he said quietly. Father Santoro passed the gear through the rails. It was a good saddle, well made but simple. Kieran let Esperanza examine it thoroughly, sniffing the leather and metal until she was satisfied it posed no threat. 10 minutes! Wade shouted gleefully. The saddle blanket went on without incident. Then the saddle itself cinched gently but securely. Esperanza's breathing quickened, but she didn't fight. When Kieran slipped the bit between her teeth, she accepted it like an old friend returning home. Evangeline breathed in understanding, by someone kind. Someone who loved her. Kieran agreed, just like someone's going to love her again. 5 minutes remained when he finally grasped the saddle horn and prepared to mount. The sun was a red orb touching the western mountains, painting the stable in bloody light. Outside, Blackthorn's men stirred like vultures sensing carrion. "Kieran," Evangeline's voice was tight with emotion. "If this doesn't work, it will work," he said with quiet certainty. "Because some things are worth fighting for, and some people are worth dying for." He swung into the saddle. Espeanza exploded. The mare erupted in a display of power and fury that made the stable walls shake. She twisted, bucked, and spun with the desperate violence of an animal fighting for its life. Kieran rode her like he was born to it, moving with her rhythm instead of fighting against it, his body flowing like water over stone. "Stay with her," Father Santoro called out. "Don't let her feel trapped." For 30 seconds that felt like hours. Horse and rider battled not against each other, but against the fear and pain that had shaped them both. Then, as suddenly as it began, the storm passed. Esperanza stood, trembling but still, her sides heaving, her eyes no longer wild but curious. Kieran leaned forward to stroke her neck. "Good girl," he murmured. "We understand each other now, don't we?" He guided her in a slow circle around the stall, then a faster one. By the time he dismounted, Esperanza was nuzzling his shoulder like a pet seeking affection. The sun disappeared behind the mountains. Just as Kieran's boots touched the ground, "Well, I'll be damned," someone said softly. It was Sheriff Wade, staring at the transformed horse and rider with something approaching. Behind him, Blackthorn's face was a mask of barely controlled rage. "The wager is settled," Father Santoro announced formally. "Mr. McBride has successfully ridden the mare. He wins $100. He handed over a small leather purse. "Combined with his existing funds, that makes $700 total." Blackthorn stepped forward, his voice deadly quiet. "This isn't over." "Yes," said a new voice from the stable entrance. "It is." Doc Morrison emerged from the gathering shadows, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood Marshal Theodore Cross, the territorial marshal whose jurisdiction superseded local law enforcement. Cross was a legend, a man who'd cleaned up 3 different counties and earned a reputation for absolute incorruptibility. "Judge Blackthorn," Marshal Cross said pleasantly, his weathered face betraying nothing. "Fancy meeting you here?" Blackthorn's face went pale. "Marshal, what brings you to Copper Creek?" "Oh, this and that. It's mostly following up on some interesting reports about irregularities in local auctions, intimidation of citizens, and abuse of authority." Cross's smile was cold as winter steel. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Sheriff Wade shifted nervously. "Marshal, I can explain. I'm sure you can, Sheriff. In fact, I'm looking forward to hearing all about it, along with Explanations for the 3 women who've gone missing from your jurisdiction in the past 2 years? Cross's hand rested casually on his gun belt. All last seen, heading toward Judge Blackthorn's ranch. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Blackthorn's men began edging toward their horses, sensing the shift in power. Now, Marshal Cross continued conversationally. I understand there was a legal auction here today. Debt legitimately sold, a wager legitimately won. Seems to me this young man has fulfilled all requirements. He nodded toward Kieran. Congratulations. Son, the lady is legally free of her father's debts, and you're her legal guardian, I suppose. Actually, Evangeline spoke up clearly. I'd like to clarify that arrangement. Every eye turned to her. She stepped closer to Kieran, her chin high with the same defiance she'd shown on the auction block. I want to marry him, she announced. Tonight, if possible. Father Santoro, would you perform the ceremony? Kieran's heart stopped. Evie, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. She turned to face him fully, her emerald eyes bright with unshed tears. I want to. I've wasted 15 years being afraid of what other people would think, of what my father would say, of stepping outside the life that was planned for me. Today you risked everything, your savings, your mother's medicine money, your own freedom just to give me a choice. Now I'm choosing. But your reputation, your standing in the community. What community? She gestured toward the men who'd watched her auctioned like cattle. What standing? I have nothing left except the chance to build something new with. The one person who's ever seen me as more than a commodity. Father Santoro stepped forward. I would be honored to perform the ceremony. Marshal Cross, would you serve as witness? Gladly, the marshal replied. Then his attention shifted back to Blackthorn. Judge, I think it's time you and I had a private conversation, along with Sheriff Wade and his deputies. As the corrupt officials were led away under armed escort, Kieran found himself alone with Evangeline in the stable's golden lamplight. Esperanza watched them curiously from her stall, as if she too sensed the momentous nature of the moment. You sure? Kieran asked quietly. Once we do this, there's no going back to the life you knew. The life I knew was a cage, Evangeline replied, reaching up to touch his face. This is freedom. The ceremony took place in the small chapel as the first stars appeared overhead. Doc Morrison gave the bride away. Marshal Cross and several townspeople served as witnesses. And Father Santoro spoke words of commitment and hope that echoed in the simple wooden space. When Kieran kissed his new wife, Evangeline tasted like tears and new beginnings. 3 months later, they lived in a small cabin on land purchased with the money left over from the auction settlement. Kieran worked the neighboring ranches while Evangeline took in sewing and taught reading to the local children. It wasn't a grand life, but it was theirs. Eas berets in their small pasture. No longer the frightened, broken animal she'd been. Like her owners, she'd learned to trust again. Marshal Cross had been thorough in his investigation. Blackthorn was serving 20 years in territorial prison. Sheriff Wade had fled west ahead of arrest warrants, and 3 women previously presumed dead had been found and returned to their families. On quiet evenings, Kieran and Evangeline would sit on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and red. Sometimes they talked about their dreams, the larger farm they'd build, children they hoped to have, the future spreading out before them like an unwritten book. But mostly, they just held each other close. 2 people who'd learned that love was worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth believing in even when the odds seemed impossible. In the distance, Speranza whinnied softly to the wind, a sound of pure contentment that carried across the prairie like a benediction. Some stories end with grand gestures and dramatic declarations. This one ended with something rarer and more precious to people who'd found their way home to each other, the quiet certainty that tomorrow would be better than today. The ranch hand had loved her for years, lost her to circumstances beyond his control, and then fought heaven and earth to win her back. But in the end, the greatest victory wasn't in the winning, it was in the choosing. The daily decision to build something beautiful together from the ashes of what they'd lost, and they lived, if not happily ever after, then happily enough, which was more than most people dared to dream.